So it's my pleasure to introduce the next set of speakers. So first we have Professor Mike Wilkinson, and he's going to be talking on grass silage, getting it right. He's based at the University of Nottingham since 2005 and is a special professor in the School of Biosciences. He's been talking about grass silage and grassland management and grassland research since as long as I can remember, and for those of you that can't notice my grey hairs, it's quite a long time. He has previously worked at the Grassland Research Institute, White College, Leeds University and Cambridge University. And his main areas of research are into the losses associated with silage making and the efficiency of feed used by livestock and the diet formulation for dairy cows. He is a silage expert with over 40 years' experience as a researcher, advisor, teacher and farmer. And I'd just like you to welcome him to the stage this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. How do you follow John Huxley? With great difficulty. I think that speech, is he here? Is John here? He's gone. He's here. I think, oh, he's there. John, I think that speech was the best speech I've ever heard by a boffin in my entire life. Without a shadow of doubt. I can't hope to follow it. I mean, he even had, you know, videos and cheese and all sorts of wonderful things. And long may it continue, John. Keep up the good work. So we're going to change the subject completely now and talk about silage. What's new? What can I say? Well, whilst you're all still listening, we'll have the concluding slide. And then if the temperature rises up, you can just fall gently into a nice slumber. We all know that, you know, we set off with good intentions. The weather goes wrong. The contractor doesn't come. Too much silage is not fit for purpose, unfortunately. And last year was a very good example of a window of opportunity. If you took it, and some of my neighbours did, got some really good silage. We're talking about grass silage now. And if you waited, then we were into a long period of rain. And unfortunately, things happen all too often like that. I'm going to talk about losses and trying to reduce them to the minimum. And I'm also going to talk about the consequences of delayed harvest. And you can see there, it's the net cost, and I'll explain how I got to that figure, is 9p per cow per day of winter feeding. And we can minimise losses by doing all these things which you've all heard about before. And I'm going to be concentrating on dry matter density, and I'm going to be concentrating on sealing the silo, and I'm going to be talking about rapid feed out. And I'm also going to be talking about a thing that Hank alluded to earlier on this afternoon, which is exerting control over the silage making process. Because all too often I don't think we exert enough control, and we certainly don't have the written protocols often that perhaps we should have. And I've certainly learnt that this afternoon. So here are some quotes which will make you even more depressed. It's a hashy-rushy job. I wish I could be rid of it. Most of last year's, these are quotes I've heard from farmers. Most of last year's silage was rubbish. We own 4 old forage harvesters, 2 that work and 2 for spares. When the crop's in the silo, I've already spent the money on it. So, you know, I've spent all this money, I've grown the crop, I've put the fertiliser on, I've grown the crop, I've harvested it, I've put a lot of effort in. I want to minimise losses from that point on to prevent it from being even more expensive. And I'm fed up with having to clean mouldy, rotten silage off the top of the pit. I can't afford the time, and it's a waste of feed. So that's, you know, just to get us really sort of focusing on what we're talking about. There are 3 teams that are really crucial in making good quality silage. There's the team that does the cutting and the harvesting. There's the team that does the ensiling, the packing of the silo. I'll be saying quite a bit of that. And there's the team that does the feeding. And often on some of the larger farms, there is a disconnect between what goes on in making the silage and what goes on during the feed-out period. I'm going to try and focus a bit on that later on. And obviously, you know, we need to communicate, we need to cooperate, and there needs to be clear responsibilities and sharing responsibilities. Now, I did this slide without knowing what Hank was going to say. And at the bottom there it says senior member on packing truck. That doesn't mean an old man or an old woman. It means somebody in charge. Somebody, one of the senior members of the ensiling team, of those three teams, should be on the packing tractor. Remember, Hank said, that's me on top of the silo, on the tractor, on that big drive-over pile. There's a huge range in losses. I came across a trial recently from the Bavarian State Research Centre involving 26 early cut grass crops, wilted for 24 hours, and 18 maize silage crops, with all crops, I'm reading from the thing now, all crops harvested by self-propelled meter chop harvester, chopped to 20 to 50 millimetres for grass, or 4 to 9 millimetres for maize, ensiled according to best practice guidelines. Losses of dry matter from ensiling to the point of feed out range from 0 to 26% for the grass. And if you add those up, you get, whoops. If you add those up, you get somewhere similar to that. For the grass, 0 to 26% for the grass and 0 to 23% for the maize. Huge range on one farm, trying to do the job as best they could. Now, why was that? We'll try and unpick that as we go along. So we've got three main sort of areas here in the field, in the silo, and top spoilage and aerobic deterioration during feed out. And at least two of these, this is actually minimizing the loss in digestibility, because you can get some loss in digestibility if you get a really rank butyric fermentation in the silo. But I've assumed it's all good stuff. You get a 3 percentage unit drop in digestibility on average, typically, and a 1 percentage unit drop with the maize. And what this means is if you start with 100 kilograms of dry matter for grass and 100 kilograms for maize, you get these weights at the different stages, at ensiling, at the feed out, and in the feed trough. So the difference between that one and that one is the field loss. The difference between that one and that one is in silo. The difference between that one and that one is aerobic spoilage. And adding on the ME, it starts off at, I've assumed it starts off at 11.5 for both. You end up with 10.9, 11.2. Very typical values for grass and maize silage. And putting some costs on that, and assuming that at the time of ensiling, the grass and the maize both cost the same, and we know they probably don't, but I've assumed for the sake of simplicity, £35 per tonne fresh weight at ensiling. The costs increase as the losses occur, so that we go from 1.08, compared to dairy cake in January from Mike Green's book, of £240 a tonne, high energy dairy cake, 2.02 pence per megajoule of ME. So you can see how the costs are creeping up from being about half that of dairy cake to being almost 2/3 that of dairy cake at the feed trough. So what can we do to reduce these? Well, the first thing to do is to start as early in the season as possible as far as the grass crop is concerned, and not to leave maize crops too late also in the autumn. I mean, this is all very well. We all know this. This is all sort of well established. We know that we should be prepared and do all these things, and I'm sure those of you who are farmers have already done all this, and you're about to clean your silos out and get your equipment prepared if you've got it on the farm. How do we predict ear emergence in grass? Well, we can look at the recommended list and look at the varieties that we've sown, hybrid ryegrasses, for example, 3rd week of May. Now, we're at the race course, Mr. Chairman, so I'm going to have a punt, I think, whatever it is, 5 to 4 on an early spring, because I think things are warming up. And so moving rapidly down, we know what the seeds are going to do, hopefully. We can start looking at soil temperatures in March. Some of you are old enough to remember T-sum 200, which was an accumulated temperature from New Year onwards, which gave you an indication of when to put fertiliser on. We can do the same sort of thing. This is old stuff, and it's probably a bit, we ought to be bringing it a bit further forward now, or increasing these temperatures a bit. But it's certainly what it says is that a 2-degree decrease in average March soil temperature, that might be average February soil temperature these days, at 30 centimetres depth, gave a week's delay in ear emergence. So we can perhaps use soil temperature as a guide to when the grass is going to reach heading date, because when it starts growing, then everything follows. So cutting early in the season, why do we do it? We do it because if we do that, if we actually achieve it, soil moisture is still adequate to produce a rapid regrowth. The leaf bases are still green, and often with a delayed harvest, you get these white aftermaths, which you see, which mean the plant has actually lost the ability to photosynthesize. It's got to start regenerating chloroplasts, regenerating the ability to photosynthesize, drawing on its root reserves. And also, when the plant produces stem tissue, when it produces a head and a flower with seed on, it loses the hormones to tiller that stimulate tillering, that stimulate new shoots coming up from ground level. And if you cut the plant early enough, it still produces new tillers. So you actually get a better sward density in the regrowth. And finally, on a practical level, if the weather deteriorates, a pause can be taken without losing too much quality. And the early cut grass silage has higher feed value. So the general rule is to be ready to start in the first spell of good weather after the beginning of May. However, not always does that happen, not always is it possible, because the weather changes, it goes wet, the contractor arrives late, and some other reason happens, you know, something detracts you. I shouldn't say, I shouldn't be sexist, but you can read it for yourself. And the consequences are that the crop is actually growing very rapidly at this point. It's trying to produce a seed head and reproduce itself. That's its purpose in life. And so its dry matter yield goes up in that week, and I've assumed it goes up 10%. But its D value goes down, as we well know, ME goes down, and because you've got a heavier crop when you cut it, you've got higher field losses during the wilting period, principally due to plant respiration. And, as I've just said, you have a slower regrowth. So what does that cost? Well, we've got our 1,000 kilograms of dry matter as before, at 11.5 ME. We've delayed cutting, so we've increased yield by 10%, but ME's gone down. ME at feeding, slightly higher losses here than here, and so the cost actually has not gone up. The cost has gone down. So we've got a cheaper crop because of the high yield, despite its lower energy value. Pause for effect. We now have to consider the consequences for the cow. Because the silage is of lower energy value, she's going to eat less. And I've assumed 11 kilos of the earlier cut material. Hank told me over lunch his cows are eating 12 kilos of dry matter per day of corn silage and maize silage. His cows are quite big, he told me, but so he's doing very well. So 11 kilos we've assumed here, 9.9. This is what research tells us on average. This is research principally from Ireland and from Scandinavia. Tells us that as ME goes down, the cow's intake goes down because it takes longer for the stuff to digest in the rumen and pass on down the alimentary tract. So she doesn't eat quite as much. So her ME intake, her metabolizable energy intake, is reduced by almost 20 megajoules per day. Still, the cost is less. The cost per unit is less. She's eating less of it. So the cost of the silage is, what, 40 pence less per day. But, so you're saving, 39 pence. You're saving 39 pence in silage. But she's not getting 20 megajoules of ME. So if you want to maintain energy intake and maintain milk output, you have to come in with extra concentrate. And the extra compound is estimated at 2 kilos per head per day, because the more concentrate you feed, the less silage she eats. So it's not just a simple substitution. And that cost at £240 a tonne is 48 pence. So that's where this 9 pence net cost comes from. That's to maintain milk yield. So the cost of 1 week's delay so far, the silage is cheaper, but it's lower feed value. More concentrate is required to maintain milk. The net cost is 9 pence, 8 or 18 quid a cow over a 200-day winter. The break-even cost of concentrate, to break even that 39 pence a day saving, is £195 per tonne. Well, we might get it. We might get cheap concentrate. Who knows? But the thing is, if you don't increase the concentrate, because the cow's eating 20 megajoules of ME less per day, milk yield's going to go down by about 300 litres over the winter, worth 75 quid a tonne, 75 quid a cow at 25 pence per litre. And there are all the other consequential costs of lower energy intake, which John alluded to in the previous talk, of condition score loss, anestrus, conception rate down, and so on. So what that says is it's better, if you do get a week's delay, it's actually better to feed more concentrates than to accept the fact that the silage is not as good and therefore milk is going to be down. It's better to maintain milk yield if you can, even at 240 quid a tonne. Okay, so what can we do to mitigate the adverse effects of delayed harvesting? Well, we can try to increase the harvest window so that things don't deteriorate as fast as we would like. Early season sheep grazing is one thing. Put the sheep on, that will delay things and maybe give you another week or 10 days before heading date. Sow fields with different mixtures, sow different varieties. Italian ryegrass and hybrid ryegrasses are all good, very good. They yield very well, but they're very unforgiving as far as the decline in quality is concerned once they reach ear emergence. Book an earlier arrival date with the contractor. Get him, you know, if you can, get him to arrive at your place before he has too many breakdowns. Or get your own equipment, get the 4 old harvesters and hire a temporary team in. Or grow them more than one type of silage. Now, this is what most people have done. They've changed from an all grass to a mixture of silages so that if something goes wrong with the grass, everything isn't lost. So, you know, we can make up with whole crop, or we can make up with maize later in the season. Or we can grow crops like clover, which grow later in the season anyway, and clover doesn't have a stem and doesn't deteriorate in quality anything like as much as grass. So moving on, how do we reduce losses in the field? Well, we need to try to avoid soil and fungal contamination. I'm going to be mentioning mycotoxins in a minute, but I think, and when I say I think, I don't really know, but I think if we're going to get mycotoxins in the crop, they are more likely to come in the field than in the silo. So if we have a lot of dead stuff in the bottom of the grass swath, that's an ideal microclimate for the undesirable fungi to grow and the undesirable bacteria to grow as well. So we need to try and avoid that, cut to a minimum of 50, and I was reading last night, somebody was saying 70 millimetres above ground level. And with maize, again, the bottom of the base of the stem seems to be a good place for fusarium infections to occur. So avoid it, leave a 15 centimetre, 150 millimetre stubble height above ground level. Avoid prolonged wilting. This slide is a bit difficult to see at the back, and I apologise for it. It's an old slide. On the vertical is dry matter loss in the field as a percent, 10, 20, 30. Along the bottom is dry matter percent, 20, 40, 60, 80. Days in the field, 0 to 1, 1 to 4, 2 to 6, and 3 to 8. So basically what this says, and this is weather conditions, poor, moderate, or good. In good weather, field losses are quite low. The crop is wilting fast. The solar radiation is getting the water out, and the dry matter is going up with relatively little loss until you get up to about 60% dry matter. Well, you wouldn't do that these days with bunker silage, but you might with baled silage. And you could even overwilt. In poor conditions, at the same dry matter concentration, much higher field losses, simply because the rate of water loss is much slower. The plant is trying to keep alive by respiring, and you'll remember from your school biology that respiration produces three things we don't want: carbon dioxide, water, and heat. We don't want any of those. So, good weather, if possible, and you know, what most people say is don't prolong wilting, particularly in showery weather. Spread the swath out. The swath should occupy the whole area of the ground, if possible, after it's been mown. And there are some mowers that will leave a wide swath. There are some that won't. But spreading the swath out has been shown in very detailed research in Ireland to increase rate of drying more than conditioning, tedding, turning, and all these other things. So just spreading the crop out does the job very well. Row up before rain and row up if the crop is getting too dry. Okay, moving further on to the senior person on the packing tractor. This slide was taken in Hungary, and some of you will be familiar with these railway wheels that are used to assist the consolidation process. Note the single wheels, no double wheel tractors, not a good idea. Unfortunately, the silo has become the bottleneck. We've got these big self-propelled harvesters capable of delivering very large amounts, 100, 120 tons fresh weight per hour, and we can't really cope. We get a lot of loads coming in that aren't packed properly, and the research that's been done in Germany shows that the depth of consolidation is only about 20, 25 centimetres. So, you know, there's no point in having a huge pile. The tractor rolls over it, and the stuff underneath doesn't get consolidated. The air isn't squashed out. There's too much oxygen in the system. So the general rule is that the target packing tractor weight in tons, say, equals the delivery weight in tons of fresh crop per hour times 0.25. So if you're getting 100 tons of crop coming into to a bunker silo per hour, you need 25 tons of packing tractor weight, more if the crop is very dry, as you'll see later. And again, senior person on packing tractor. And I wrote that before Hank actually said it. I was delighted when he said it, absolutely brilliant. There's me on top of the silo. Packing thin layers. Density has a big impact on dry matter losses, particularly at the sides and at the top. And there's some figures for densities. You'll see more density figures in a minute. This is some work in the USA. And if I can be political for a minute, most of what I'm talking about is from recent research done outside the UK, because there is virtually no silage research going on in the UK at the moment. Sad to say. Anyway, I think we're going to have a pause for effect there, haven't we? Pause for effect. Okay. What this slide says is that if you look at dry matter loss in the silo as a percent going from 0 to 13, and this is brown midrib maize silage done in the USA, and they did very detailed studies looking at dry matter density in kilograms per cubic metre, and there was a huge range from 150 right up to 325, and you can see how dry matter losses decrease as density increases. So this is the importance of getting the stuff consolidated, whether it's grass or maize. This is the most techie slide I've got, John, and it almost beats yours, I think. I think it does beat yours. This is a response surface. Okay, three-dimensional graph. Dry matter loss on the vertical. It's from the same study as before, but what they've done is they've now added in dry matter concentration. Dry matter percent ranging from 27 to 39. So some of the silage was really dry, some of it wasn't. And on this third axis is dry matter density, going from 150, lowest, up to 320 or so. So what it says is that density has a much bigger effect on dry matter loss on the right-hand side of the graph with the drier silages than it does at the left-hand side of the graph. And this is within this range. A lot of grass silage comes in at around 30% dry matter. So I think this is quite relevant. And you can see that if you get density down as low as 150 with a dry crop, your losses go shooting up simply because you cannot get the oxygen out, and there's too much oxygen, too much carbon dioxide produced, and the dry matter just disappearing into thin air as carbon dioxide and water. So how do we achieve higher silage dry matter densities at harvest? Well, we can reduce chop length. Good idea with drier crops, and Hank reinforced that when I was talking to him earlier. We can reduce the forage delivery rate. We can tell the forage harvester driver to slow down. Now, he's driving a machine that's cost a fortune. He's not going to slow down. He wants to get on to the next place as fast as possible. So it's not likely to happen. So we have to increase, or we should aim to increase the packing tractor weight. That is possible. We can get more tractors in, get old tractors, as long as they're clean, running up and down. We can increase the number of tractors on the silo as long as there's space. We can reduce the layer of forage that we pack, and a lot of people can do that. It's not always possible, but they can do it if they have time. They can dribble it up along the way and pack it very well. A good man will do that. We can increase the height or the depth of the silo. A lot of people have to do that. You know, they go even higher, way above the safety rails. Not a good idea. Tractors can roll off. We can pack away at the end of the day. We can roll and roll and roll and roll and roll at the end of the day. Waste of time. The damage has already been done. If you haven't packed it as you've gone along, then it ain't going to do much good rolling at the end of the day. So how do we manage losses from that point onwards? We've packed the silo. We're now, the stuff's sitting there. How can we reduce losses? Well, we can look at fermentation, we can look at shrinkage, we can look at covering, we can look at spoiled silage, and we can look at oxygen barrier film. The fermentation may be efficient, inefficient, or downright nasty. If we get butyric acid, smelly stuff, smells like vomit, animals don't like it. So, but that all depends on the natural microbial population on the crop, its dry matter concentration, its sugar concentration, and all the rest, all the stuff you've heard from the additive people over the years. And there is no doubt from the research that's been done that the additive can direct the fermentation towards lactic acid, which is the most efficient, with the homos, the homo fermentative, the homolactics, e.g. Lactobacillus plantarum, or the additive can direct the fermentation towards acetic acid. Less efficient process, but it does inhibit yeast and molds and can increase aerobic stability. This next slide is a meta-analysis. John, are you impressed? A meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is what the boffins and the medics do when they're testing treatment A versus treatment B, pill A versus pill B, in one hospital with one set of patients, and they get one result, and then they do it again in another hospital. Maybe the formulation is slightly different, people are obviously different, dose rate might be slightly different, and so they get another set of results, and eventually they put all these results together in what's known as a meta-analysis to see whether across all the trials, whether there is a difference. This is 11 trials. This was David Davis's study that we published a couple of years ago in Grass and Forage Science. 11 trials with heterolactic fermentation, e.g. Buchneri. This is as a percent of untreated silage, that's silage without any additive at all, and 8 trials where they had homolactic, e.g. plantarum, again as a percent of the untreated silage. So you can see, looking at lactic acid, in average of those 11 trials, Buchneri reduced lactic acid compared to untreated silage, whereas the homolactic increased lactic acid by 137%. Acetic acid, the Buchneri increased acetic, the homolactic reduced acetic. The loss of dry matter, however, due to fermentation was almost doubled with the Buchneri because it's a less efficient fermentation. In the process of producing acetic acid, other things are produced in the silo, principally carbon dioxide, and that is a loss of carbon, a loss of dry matter. The homolactics reduced loss of dry matter, almost halved. And as far as aerobic stability was concerned, the heterolactic did the job of increasing aerobic stability. In fact, in 3 trials, there was no heating at all during the period of study. However, the price you pay for improving the efficiency of the fermentation is that often, and in this case in 8 trials, aerobic stability was reduced to almost half that of the untreated silage. So you pay your money and you get your choice. You pay your money and you get whatever. So when to use an additive? When there's a problem which can't be solved by other means. So for example, if you're getting a lot of horrible stinking butyric silage, you need a powerful bug that's going to produce more lactic acid. If you've got a problem with aerobic stability, the stuff's going off, going mouldy, you're not feeding out fast enough, you need something that's going to produce more acetic acid to increase aerobic stability because of its inhibitory effect on yeast and molds. When the livestock are likely to be at risk of disease, e.g. mycotoxicosis, well, that's a good one. A lot of maize seems to be infected with fungi as time goes on, particularly with later harvest. And so, you know, if you think there's a problem likely to be evident of mycotoxicosis, and it is difficult to diagnose, then maybe something ought to be added that's going to inhibit mold development. However, having said that, as I said earlier, a lot of the mycotoxins seem to be formed in the field before the crop even gets into the silo. So an additive may not do the trick. When the product is of high value, for example, Colston, Bassett, Stilton, there are parts of Europe where silage making is prohibited because of the risk of what's known as secondary blowing in hard cheese. This is clostridial spores. Clostridia are anaerobes. They're the ones that produce the stinking butyric acid in silage. They can infect milk, and they can start to feed on the lactic acid in the cheese and produce gas, and the cheese explodes. Boom, it's gone. It's ruined. So, for example, if you go to the Parma area of Italy, where they make Parmesan cheese, if you go to areas of Switzerland where they make Emmental cheese, there are areas in France where silage making isn't prohibited, but it's actively discouraged because of the risk of this secondary blowing. So, again, a good reason for using an additive if you're producing a hard cheese and you don't want to lose it. And again, when crop and environmental conditions are against a good fermentation, e.g. Wet lucerne. Lucerne is notoriously low in sugars and difficult to make into good silage. That's all I want to say about additives. Shrinkage. The silo settles due to loss of digestible nutrients from the outer layer. This loss, as I've said, is invisible, carbon dioxide and water. It happens mostly in the outer half meter, and what remains is about half of what you started with. And it's generally considered inedible. Certainly if it's gone brown, black, slimy, horrible, it's definitely inedible. But the thing that's exercising me at the moment is how do you decide what is edible and what is not edible? Obviously, silage which is visibly mouldy should not be fed to animals. Obviously, silage which is discoloured and smells wrong should also not be fed to animals. But it's very subjective, unfortunately, and we need to do a lot more to beef up deciding on what is edible and what is inedible by some proper tests. Now, a lot of this outer layer waste can be reduced, if not eliminated, by covering the silo effectively, by stopping air movement, and it took me 30 years to realise, to cotton on to the fact that standard polyethylene film is actually permeable to oxygen. And so, you know, we need something better, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Seal holes with tape protect the film from wind, birds, animals, vermin and children. And we don't want this. Well, you know, animals can get on silos, children can run around, vermin can certainly chew holes. We don't want this sort of thing to happen at all if we can possibly avoid it. And as I said, the outer layer, the periphery of the silo is where a lot of the action occurs, which results in the black layer. Here you see a freshly exposed maize silo, and using a thermal imaging camera, you can see the heated areas here, 41 centigrade at the top, 26 in the core. And that's simply, I think, a factor of lower density, more air penetrating in, a lot more bacterial activity and yeast activity going on in the top layer. Yeah.
You said we shouldn't roll the plant when we're finished. But if most of the spoilage is in that top meter, you know, on the one that you showed, like 2
Yeah.
is there a way that you can prevent that?
Yes, I'm just about to say that. Very good question. The reason it is a waste of time rolling the top layer is, and you know if you've done it, I mean I've done it, the stuff just bounces back up unless it's very wet. And if it's very wet, it goes to a mush. So, you know, you don't really want to be overdoing it. That's the point I was trying to make. There is a way of preventing it, and I'll come on to it in a minute. So, spoiled silage, oxygen transmission, lower density, and the effects are you get this black mouldy layer, particularly at the shoulders, if you haven't rolled the shoulders properly. Growth of Clostridia. It's odd that the researchers are finding more clostridial spores in deteriorating outer layers because they're anaerobes, and it must be that they're growing in little pockets of anaerobic conditions. Listeria particularly, and on the outer layers of bales, listeria can be rampant because the outer layer of the bale is the wettest, moisture migrates to the wrap, and if you've got an infection of listeria from the soil, you can get a lot of listeria growing in the outer layer of a bale. Yeast and molds, reduced aerobic stability, and we think, I'm not sure, increased mycotoxin risk, because we know that fungi will produce toxins when they're stressed. In other words, when there's not enough oxygen for them to grow freely. So limited oxygen may result in toxins being formed. This is not a new problem. For those of you at the back, this says spoilt silage, sour, mouldy, rotten, frozen. Its causes and effects, the sure cure is the preventative, by Joseph Pascoe, published in 1915. And what he said is the surface of the silo must be kept as nearly level as possible, so maybe filling bunkers on the wedge is not perhaps ideal. Should the fodder be left to form piles, mould spots will appear. And we often see these sort of patches of white mould when we open the silo up. And that could be that it's an area that we just didn't consolidate as well as we should. The processing or tramping of silage should be done with care and precaution. The more silage is tramped, the better, especially next to the silo wall. This part of the silo must be well tramped. This is a farm study done some years ago in Kansas, 127 farm silos. Now, the strange thing about the USA is that for years, and to this day, a lot of farmers do not cover their silos at all with anything. So, this was a study looking at the effect of no cover at all with a standard polyethylene sheet. And the average loss in the top half metre was 47%. So what that means is that if you've got a black slimy layer at the top, you've lost about half the dry matter. In the next half metre down, the losses were much lower, 11% with no cover. So it's this top half metre where the loss, this is the percent of what was inside originally, and done by burying bags and weighing before and after and all that sort of thing. Much lower losses with the cover. And there's very few bits of evidence on what does this do to the animal when you feed this black spoiled layer. I'll show you 2 trials. I've only been able to find 2 trials in the entire literature. I'm sure there are more, but I haven't found them yet. you get reduced intake, you get reduced digestibility. Let's look at that. This is a trial done in the USA with maize silage, where they fed normal, this was ag-bagged silage, so it was really well packed, really well sealed stuff, and they put some spoilt silage from a bunker which hadn't been covered in with it, mixed it in, 25%, 75%, and these were all, almost all significant effects. Reduced intake, reduced digestibility, and it seemed to interfere with the rumen mat, and so fibre digestion was depressed. So the intake of digestible material was decreased by quite a lot more. So not a good result. As I've just said, there is an increased risk of mycotoxins, low milk yield, reduced fertility, increased incidence of other diseases. Now, to answer your question, what can we do to stop this top layer coming? Well, there's this stuff called oxygen barrier film, developed for food packaging originally. It's a co-extruded polyethylene ethyl vinyl alcohol. That's the oxygen barrier bit. And it's virtually impermeable to oxygen. Here you see it's thin, low oxygen transmission rate compared to standard polyethylene film. And here's another meta-analysis that I was involved in with a statistician. 41 trials looking at loss of dry matter in the upper layer of bunkers and drive-over piles, the sort of pile that Hank showed earlier on this afternoon. Standard plastic, 19.5% loss, 11.4% loss, highly significant result. 11 trials where aerobic stability of the top layer, the layer you saw heating up in that previous slide, 75 hours, and aerobic stability is measured as the number of hours before the temperature rises up to 2 degrees above ambient. It's a standard laboratory test. So 75 hours before the stuff was 2 degrees above ambient, and then it went up, and compared to 135 hours for the oxygen barrier film. And this is one of the split silo trials where you see the typical sort of black slimy stuff on the standard black plastic, and this was actually black plastic with the silo stop underneath it, showing virtually no top spoilage. In edible silage, this is again subjective, 5 trials where it was actually measured as a percent of the total dry matter inside originally, 10.7 standard plastic and only 3% for the silo stop. That means it takes less time to discard what bits there are off the top and shoulders and less risk of accidentally including inedible silage in the diet. This is the aerobic stability again, 75, 134 for 11 trials. All the comparisons were with maize. And this average increase was 2.5 days of extra aerobic spoilage. Okay. This shows one of the trials, one of those 11 trials, with maize with no additive. It was extremely stable, this one. This was a trial done in Hungary. This is the black line showing the conventional film, silage, top layer, and this is the oxygen barrier film. So you can see it took almost 261 hours to get to 2 degrees above ambient. Right, finally, the feed-out period. As soon as you open the silo, things can start to happen because oxygen is being introduced into the mass of the silo through the exposed silo face. And some silages heat up within 24 hours of exposure to air. And I've been involved in court cases where farmers have had to throw away almost the entire silage because the stuff has gone off so rapidly. Very serious problem when it happens. Air can penetrate in behind the feed face, particularly with grass silage, up to 1 metre. So although the exposed face itself may be cool, behind the face it may be hot. Research has shown that yeasts play an important role. They feed on the lactic acid, the pH rises, aerobic bacteria then grow, the temperature rises, and the molds grow and the silage goes wrong. So here's the target, 1 to 2 metres feed out per week, 2 to 3 metres feed out per week. This is movement down the silo in summer. This is an example of some maize silage that was ensiled at 126 kilograms of dry matter per cubic metre. So it was about half the recommended density. The contractor had done a rushy job, he piled it up, he hadn't rolled it properly, and within, and this was within a few weeks of opening, 20 centimetres. This was a thermometer put in 20 centimetres, and it was reading 65 degrees centigrade. And you can see it's all going horribly grey and mouldy. Not a good sight. This is a trial in Italy with maize. Silage face visibly moulded percent from 0 to 20, and weekly feed-out rate in metres. And the dotted line encircles people who were doing the very best practice of sealing with an oxygen barrier film, compacting really well, and getting the stuff really dense. And they're about the only people who were able to control moulding at less than a metre per week. And it didn't seem to matter very much whether you were feeding out in winter or in summer. This is a trial from Germany, from the University of Bonn, where they were looking at the effects of exposure of silage to air on the animal, and I'll show you the effects in a minute. Exposing either 0, 4 or 8 days exposure to air. So if you're working across a bunker and it takes you a week to get across the bunker, that means that most of the silage in the outer exposed area is going to be exposed for about a week. And you can see how pH went up. Most of the changes occurred between 4 and 8 days. Lactic acid disappeared, acetic acid went right down, yeasts shot up in the first 4 days. This is a log scale, so that's 3 log, or 2.5 log, so that's 10, 100-fold increase. Molds increased after 8 days exposure, and the aerobic bacteria increased as well, steadily. Accumulated temperature, the temperature took off after 4 days, so that by 8 days, the stuff was hotter than air. And the effect on the animal, they fed this to goats for 3-hour periods and measured intake. And you can see not a lot of effect on intake with 4 days exposure, but a huge effect with 8 days. This was an almost 60% decrease in feed intake. This slide shows the importance of removing silage from the silo and feeding it straight away. This is a slide taken in Poland, actually, and I think the machine is from Israel. This is the remover of the silage from the silo, and this is the mixer wagon all in one. And that's the feed paste. This was a lucerne silage, the feed paste it was leaving behind. No time. Right. Do not give rejected silage to livestock, may be contaminated and cause disease. Finally, I just want to say this, a word about safety. Many of our bunker silos are too small, and we're overfilling them, and they don't have a safety rail. So we need to be very careful that we don't go too high. Ensure the silo is well lit, avoid working alone, and if you get prosecuted, and there is this law, RIDOR, Reporting of Injuries, Diseases and Dangerous Occurrences Regulations 2013, that if a work-related accident happens, you have an obligation by law to report it. And if, unfortunately, you get prosecuted, then you're in for a fine. The average fine was 40,000 in 2013-14. So, in conclusion, plan for an early start, keep control, communicate, keep the crop as clean as possible, cut a dry crop in the afternoon. Additive can reduce losses if you need it. Consolidate well, use an oxygen barrier film, protect the film from damage, feed out as rapidly as possible, and keep safety in mind at all times. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We now have time for questions. If you could give your name
Oh.
and take some questions. Any questions?
Mike.
Yeah.
Mike, can I ask, Richard Hales from sunny West Wales, top of the fairway to be here today. Just one question you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation. If there was a decrease of 2 degrees in temperature, in March, there'd be a 1 week delay in cutting. If it goes the other way,
Yeah.
does it work the same?
Yes, I'm assuming it does.
Right, okay.
I think it does. I don't know. There's been no research on this for 30 years. But I think it probably does. That's why I said I'm betting that it's going to be an early spring. Certainly if this weather lasts for a few days.
If your employer won't buy the silo stock film, does multiple black sheets work as effectively?
The more sheets, the better. Obviously, what you're doing is each sheet has an oxygen barrier effect. So the more you put on, the better. And I've known some people, put 5 or 6 layers on, and it's the same with bales. The more wraps, the better. And some of the horse people will put up to 12, even 16 layers of wrap on a bale because they're scared stiff that there might be a bit of mould, and they don't want a trace of mould in the bale. And when you remember that, about almost 30% of the mass of a bale is in the outer 10 centimetres, it's really important to get the outer layer right. So yes, the answer is yes. The more layers, the better.
Thank you. Is this on? You said definitely use an oxygen barrier, but I was surprised you didn't say definitely use an additive. I thought that was kind of standard practice now.
Well, you'd have thought so, wouldn't you? You'd have thought so. We've just completed a study in the southwest of 46 dairy farms where we were looking at we were trying to look at the effect of silage composition on animal health. And surprisingly, only a third of farmers were using an additive. Yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But, it's maybe, times are hard. People are trying to economise. There was an association on those farms with the milk yield of the herd. The higher yielding herds were the ones that were using an additive. That's not to say that the additive was having any effect at all on milk yield, but what it was saying was that the farmers who have higher yielding herds are more likely to use an additive because they recognise the importance of high quality silage.
Yeah. How long should the clamp be closed, ideally before feeding out?
If it's grass, probably a week. If it's maize, 3 weeks. Some of the research I've been looking at from Brazil is showing that it takes at least 3 weeks for maximum digestibility of the silage to be achieved. And that's partly to do with the prolamine enzymes that are releasing the starch out of the grain, making the starch more digestible, and probably also partly to do with the plant enzymes breaking down a little bit of the cell wall in that 3 week period. I mean, maize ferments very fast, and I used to say you could feed maize out within a day or two. It will ferment very fast, but it does take this 3 week period of stabilisation for maximum digestibility to be achieved.
Are there any negative effects of having layers of, say, brewers' grains in the silage or layers of sugar beet pulp, as well as the grass silage, so layer in your feed?
Underneath. Effluent. Effluent is a definite risk with brewers' grains because you're basically putting it at the highest density of all because you've got the weight of the silage on top of it, and it will squeeze a lot of liquid out. But apart from that, no, I don't think so. There's some people have done it for years. There's one over there.
What's the maximum angle you'll take your shoulders to?
I try and keep as level as possible. I've seen some horrendous sights of people who've gone too high. And actually, Hank said that on one of the silos he was filling, he overfilled, and he couldn't do a proper drive over, because what they do is they drive over all the time and try and keep a sort of mushroom shape to these huge silos. And if you can't roll it properly, then you will get a lot higher losses. You know, you'll get 30% loss or so, even with the covering. So yeah, keep it as shallow as possible.
You demonstrated clearly the effect on silage on the first cut of going a week later. Has any work been done on the effect of the second or third cut, of delaying the first cut by a week?
Well, that's a very, very good question, because if you really do get an early cut with your first cut, then you don't prevent the plant from trying to throw up a stem. And we often see this in second cut. If you get second cut coinciding with a really hot, dry spell of weather, it'll throw up a stem, and you know, your second cut can be worse than your first cut. No, I haven't done the calculation. These are just fag packet calculations that I did. Well, they're not fag packets because I gave up smoking a long time ago, but they're just basic, you know, simple calculations that anybody can do. I mean, it's a very good question, because I don't know what the consequential effect would be. What I do know is that the more frequently you cut the grass, if you go to a place like Holland, where they'll cut it at you know, beer bottle height, you know, every 3 or 4 weeks throughout the season, what you get is not very much very high quality silage. And of course what they also have is a lot of maize. So what they're doing is they're balancing the diet by producing high protein grass silage of very high quality with low protein maize also of very high quality. And as a strategy, I think that's very laudable. It means the cost of the grass goes up because the yield per cut is low, but it's higher quality stuff to feed with maize. It's balancing the low protein in the maize.
I'd just like to thank Mike very much, and if you'd like to join me in thanking him, that'd be great. Thank you very much. Thank you.